Hi everyone, it's Ren here. I hope you're doing well, guys. Welcome to my room. We're going to talk today a little bit about how type can influence your behavior, how type can uh, add a certain color to the way you experience the world. By type here, I don't mean simply the fact of being a person of a certain type, but being a person who specifically identifies as being of that type, right? So you could take the entirety of the population of the world to have a type ascribed to them, whether they know it or not. But the percentage of people across the entire world population who explicitly and self-awarely, so to speak, identify as being of a certain type is obviously much lower. A lot of people don't know about the theory of the types. A lot of people don't care. So here we're talking about people like us, people like you and me, who identify as being of a certain type. It's a fundamental criterion that is not often distinguished. At least it's not distinguished enough between having a type and identifying as a person who has that type. I want to look at how identifying as someone who has a type can really influence your behavior. So it has a very concrete impact on your life. This is an important theme in my upcoming book as well. So as you can see, I'm not following up directly on the video that I made yesterday. I said that there would be a part 2 and that I would release it today, but I think I might keep it for next weekend or something like that. So before I move on, I've written a book on the INFJ type, which is my area of specialization. So if you haven't got it, there's a link below. It's if you want a very deep understanding of the type, that's the book to get. And there's a sequel coming out soon. Rumor has it that the main character of my novel, The Infinite Castle, is an INFJ, or a healthy INFJ, alienated an INFJ. If you're interested in a fictional exploration of that, check it out. Also, if you're into modernism, magical realism, Kafka, Dostoevsky, Murakami, and so on. And that really supports me. So does supporting me on Patreon, by the way. There's a link below, and any kind of support would be super helpful, and you get some bonus content as well. Okay, so let's look at a very concrete example, just to illustrate how having a particular type as part of your self-description is going to influence your life, is going to give a certain color to your life. And paradoxically, or not paradoxically, but rather in a related manner, if you eventually switch and decide to embrace another type, your experiences will be modified accordingly. Okay, so suppose that you identify as an INFJ, and there's many people who watch this channel that do identify as INFJ. So suppose you identify as INFJ. Suppose you have work, you have an office job, say, and in that office, in that workplace, you have a boss whom you have identified. It's not the boss himself or herself, it's you who have identified them to be ESTJ, right? This might be what we might be tempted to call a classic case. I see a lot of people complaining online about their ESTJ bosses, right? So now, imagine that you have some kind of altercation with your ESTJ boss. With your boss. Just leave aside the ESTJ for now. Maybe you suggest something, you have an idea, and they kind of, suppress it. They reject it, they're not willing to hear, and they just dismiss you, right? They say, oh, instead of trying to come up with these ideas, just try to focus on getting your results, getting your numbers for the end of the quarter. Stop bothering me with that woo-woo stuff about coming up with new ideas for this. So, a situation that I've been through, and I'm sure some of you will have been through. Now imagine you can experience this outside of the personality framework, okay? In which case, you are likely to feel annoyed, frustrated. You're likely to feel like your boss is an idiot, that your boss is a short-term thinker, and so on and so forth. But now imagine that you experience the very same event with and through the prism of this personality perspective. So you're now someone who's an INFJ, and you've identified your boss as someone who's an ESTJ. And this happens. At some levels, the experience will be quite similar. You're still going to feel aggravated. You're still going to feel like your boss is an idiot. You're still going to feel like this is the best way to get you demotivated, and so on and so forth. But your experience, not just the description that you would make of the event, okay, to someone else. Because obviously the description that you would make of the event to someone else, if you have the prism of personality to complement it, will be richer, right? It will be richer because you'll be able to explain through an INFJ prism why it is that you want to come up with new ideas, and that you have these suggestions and these expectations, these sources of satisfaction that pertain to the particular essence of being an INFJ. And you also be able to provide an explanation as to how your boss is relating or reacting to your suggestions the way they are through an ESTJ prism. And so you'll be able to enrich the description by making use, for example, of the fact that maybe your boss is by the book because they have a strong sense of hierarchy, an unchanging hierarchy, that their relationship to bureaucracy is going to be very hard to budge because of the TISE that's very profoundly anchored in them. So you're going to have this whole universe of descriptions that were unavailable to you before. But something that we don't point out enough is that this ends up having an influence on the way that you experience these events. It's not just the language that, the vocabulary that is expanded. There's a very intrinsic relationship between language and experience. And to the extent that human beings are creatures of language, their experiences are informed by language. There's an example in the book of the philosopher Charles Taylor where he says, prior to language, if we imagine ourselves prior to acquiring language, it's possible to imagine experiencing the emotion of feeling angry or wrathful or desiring something. These basic kind of primal emotions you could experience, desire, repulsion, anger, these quite primal emotions. You can, so to speak, experience them outside of language, right? And in fact, they are emotions that you could probably ascribe to apes, for example. But what Charles Taylor suggests is that how would you make sense outside of language of experiencing the emotion of being indignant, right? Would it make sense? Could you be experiencing indignation? If you think hard about this, could you be experiencing indignation, which is a significantly more fine-grained emotion than just anger, outside of language, outside of the linguistic apparatus that allows us to articulate a moral framework whereby we're then able to identify being indignant as a combination of anger, but also moral condemnation? Would it be really possible to experience indignation, to experience ourselves as being indignant outside of language? No. And you can apply that to a huge spectrum of human emotions. Admiration is another one. Perhaps love itself is one. But indignation is a very good example because it allows you to show how dependent on the system of ethics it is, and how that system of ethics can't come into being fully fledged without language. And the consequence of this is that when you experience an event such as a conflict with your boss, through a prism that has enriched your language, your vocabulary, with the terminology of type, all the propositions and consequences that these entail on personality, on social interactions, the experience itself is going to be transformed. So there will be anger, there will be, frustration and these things. But you're going to be interacting with this ESTJ person. If you like, it's very likely that your frustration and feeling of being dealt unfairly is going to be deepened by a broader feeling and idea that this case is a larger case of the unproductive, tyrannical, and ultimately sterile and pointless domination of ESTJs over INFJs in the workplace. So if you like, the prism of identifying as INFJ and them as ESTJ is going to increase your indignation by universalizing it. By universalizing it, it might also bring you some solace, because you'll be able to think and realize that you're not the only one, that there's other people, your brothers and sisters of the INFJ persuasion, that will also maybe simultaneously right now are suffering at the hands of these unfair and visionless ESTJs, right? Bureaucracy obsessed ESTJs. So you're going to be able to add a whole dimension of experience that in some sense will deepen the sense of indignation, but also open up, by deepening it and universalizing it, open up a way of furthering solidarity with your INFJ brothers and sisters in similar situations. And that might give you emotional resources to actually resist. Doing this is not going to be available to you outside of those, outside of those INFJ and ESTJ prisms, the theory of personality. Of course, there can be a lot of other prisms that have nothing to do with personality. And in fact, we do that too. When we have a vocabulary, of, say, identifying as someone who's intellectual and suffering at the hands of someone who is a brute, churlish, artless brute or something like that, who doesn't have cultivation. That's also a way of bringing in a whole linguistic apparatus to bear on the quality of your experience and on the kinds of options you will have to cope. But personality is one of them, and it's important to realize that that has a real impact and should not be ignored, because it will also give you ways of making the best possible use of your personality identification to lead a good life, to lead a life that is conducive to the most flourishing for you. And again, depending on if you're an INFJ and you look at the resources you have facing an ESTJ at work, maybe the resources you consider will be different than if you identify as an INFP. And it's the situation is even more interesting if you're an INFJ, or if you identify as an INFJ, only then to realize that actually you're an INFP. Because if you identify as an INFJ, whereas you're in fact an INFP, and later come to realize you're an INFP and do identify as an INFP, you might have two conflicts with your same boss, but you won't handle them the same way. In the case of an INFJ, if you're familiar with the whole form of life that has sort of been secreted by the INFJ discourse, you're probably going to think a lot in terms of the sense of vision and the FE articulation of it, and so you're much more likely to want to take a stand against your boss, not directly, but you're going to be in some sense wanting to be vindicated at some level, and so maybe expose yourself to the possibility of further conflict. Like, that's the FE dimension. You want a solution that is not just private, like I'm going to deal with this privately and move on. You want a public dimension to it at some level. Whereas if you then move on to identify as INFP, I think your emotional experience will actually be altered to some degree, but also the path of getting outside of that quandary. Maybe if you're an INFP and you understand the vocabulary that comes with it primarily through the lens of dominant FI, you'll be quite confident that you can actually sort of retreat and sort of fix it within your FI dominance inner self, without need of validation by a kind of public exterior that is not you, but the tribe inside the company or whatever it might be. That's not acceptable if you identify as an INFJ. It's not suitable, but it's suitable if you identify as an INFP. And in fact, if you really are an INFP, that's what's good for you, because that's what you will be good at doing. That's what will be most efficient. Hence why it's quite important to, in fact, know what your real type is. Okay? But type is not just something that we decide we are. Even for somebody who is doubtful about how innate a type is, it's important to always remember that the way that we attach a type to ourselves does have, whether we like it or not, a strong influence on our experience of things, on our description of things that we experience, and our options to resolve situations that we're in. Let me know in the comments what you think, guys, and I will see you on Wednesday. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.